Hey guys, it's Courtney and I'm back with another video. I have been contacted by Ink on 3 to try out their inks and their stamps, and of course I said yes. So I'm going to be using the Fadeout ink as well as the Dance and Twirl stamp set. I'm going to be creating a scene here, and this is going to be a no-line scene. So I knew I wanted to put my characters on a stage. So here I'm just taking my pencil to kind of just map out my scene before I start coloring. I'm not artistic, so I can't just go in with my markers and expect it to look good. I have to have some sort of plan. So I'm taking, this is actually my Scotch foam tape here, but I just needed something round to trace because I'm not artistic. So I'm just, like I said, taking my pencil, kind of mapping out my little stage here, my little curtains on the side, and I will draw a straight line with my T-square ruler to actually have the floor, I guess you'd say, of the stage. Now, normally when I do Copic coloring on any kind of scene, I would say erase all of your pencil lines first, but I'm kind of going for the no line look because my little characters are going to be colored with a no line coloring technique. So I'm okay with leaving my pencil lines there, especially being I'm going to be using dark colors in my background. So it'll pretty much cover up those areas. I will, however, erase where these little folds of this curtain overlap one another, just because obviously I don't want them to be showing through once I do my Copic coloring. Once I was happy with the placement of everything, I'm going to be using a Copic Safe pen to draw the floor. It's going to be like a hardwood floor, like a regular stage floor. And Cricut pens are Copic Safe. So I didn't have a brown. So this is like a dark golden yellow. And I'm just, again, using my T-square ruler to draw in these lines. Now, because the further back the stage is, the closer these lines are going to be just from perspective wise. So I started off with that center line, it's pretty much straight. And then as I go back and off to the sides, they will be more diagonal. I'll go ahead and erase my pencil lines on that floor area because I have this pen, these pen lines to kind of guide me. Next, I'll take out my Misty, and this is a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm just going to line up my little images here, and I'm going to be using the Fadeout ink. We're going to be doing some no-line coloring, and I'm going to stamp these twice, which is why I brought out my Misty. Normally, I'd only stamp them once, but just to make it easier for you guys to see, I will stamp these twice. Next, we'll move on to the coloring itself, and this took a long time. Now I have this sped up quite a bit, and I'm skipping parts just to make it not so long, but it's a long one. So I'm starting off with this little elephant, and I'm starting off with my C1, which is my lightest color, and mapping out my darkest areas. Normally I go right in with my dark color when I'm coloring with grays, but in this case, I don't really trust myself. So I want to make sure that I have my darkest areas in the right spot. I also took a Copic Safe pen, which this is an EK Success journaling pen, and just went over the eyes. If you can always go over them after you do your coloring, but sometimes they're a little bit hard to see. Next, I went in with my darkest color and just darkened up those darkest areas. That is the C5. And I'm just doing my shading on either side of his little face. My highlight will be in the center. I did put a shadow on either side of where his little trunk is hanging over his face, or I guess, yeah, it's hanging over his face. And for his ears, I'm just doing the shading on either side. Next, I'll go in with my C3 and blend those areas out. I also created a little bit of a shadow underneath her little bow that she has in her hair or on top of her head. And then finally, I will go back in with my C1, the lightest color, and blend all of that out. Now, as with any coloring, especially no line coloring, just keep in mind you can always add more dark. You can't take away dark. So there are going to be some different areas that you may see me go back in and add a little bit more shadowing just to kind of create those shadows more, because you don't have that black line to fall back on. So for her little ears, I'm using my R20, my R01, and my R00 to add a little pink, but it was a little too pink, so I just took my C1 and went over the entire area again to kind of tone down that pink in her ears. Next, I'll move on to her body, and I am just again taking my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas, which will be underneath her head and off to the one side of her little arms, and then on her legs where her little tutu is hanging over her legs and where her legs are kind of meeting together. I did add a little bit more of a shadow on her trunk just because I didn't want my C1 to touch another area of my C1, or else you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two objects. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color. Again, this is the C5, just adding in my very darkest colors, going back in with my C3, blending that C5 out a little bit, and then finally back to my C1. If you do see like where her little trunk is hanging over her one arm, if you can't see the difference between the two objects, go back in and add a little bit more shading. You don't necessarily have to go back in with your darkest color. You can certainly go back in with your mid-tone. As long as there's a difference between those two objects, you'll be perfectly fine. Next, I'll move on to this little giraffe here in the center. And again, I'm going to start off by taking my Copic Safe Pen and just drawing over her little face, her eyes, and her little mouth there before I start the coloring. And once again, I'm going to start with my lightest color. My darkest areas for her is going to be underneath her face, like where her little chin, I guess, is, and down the one side of her neck, on underneath her little arms, and underneath her tutu and one side of her leg. Also underneath her little flower that she has in her hair. Next, I'm going in with my darkest color, and these are little teeny tiny areas, so I'm just barely touching the tip of the marker to my paper. I'll go in with my mid-tone and blend that out just a little bit. Again, very tiny areas. I'm not doing a whole lot of flicking here. I tend not to do so much of the flicking motion when it's no line coloring. There's really no reason for it, but I do find myself not really coloring like I normally do when I don't have those black lines to fall back on. Finally, I'll go back in with my lightest color and fill in the rest of these areas. And for her little spots and are they hooves? I don't know what a giraffe has, but that's what we're going to call them. I'm starting off with my E13 and just putting my shadows on the base of her little nose there and on the one side of her hooves. Next, I'll go in with the darkest color. This is the E18 and just darkening up those areas a little bit. My mid-tone color is my E15, and then I'll go back in with my E13 again. Now for her spots, I didn't do any shading on these, and I ended up taking the packaging of the stamp set so that I could kind of see where her spots were. This ink is incredible. When you color over these lines, it's like they melt right into the Copic ink, so no matter what, you're not going to see these lines. Sometimes with even very light inks, when you're doing a no line look, if you look closely, you can see these lines. Those lines, you can't see it with these. So I lost my spots. So I have to kind of draw those in myself. And then, like I said, I'm just using the packaging of the stamp to kind of guide me as to where those spots should be. Really, you can put them anywhere you'd like. Next, we'll move on to this little mouse over here. And I'm going to switch over to my warm grays just to make her a little bit different than the elephant. But again, coloring her the same exact way as I did the other two characters, going in with my lightest color. This is a W1, and doing the shading on either side of her face, underneath her little chin there, and underneath her arms, and in the inside of her legs, as well as underneath her little tutu there. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color, which is the W5, darkening up those areas again. I'm putting a little bit of shading on her ears just underneath as they kind of come up. I'll get lighter. Again, either side of her face, underneath her arms, just basically wherever it would be darker. And these are also very tiny little areas, tinier than the giraffe. So I'm really, really barely touching the paper. Sometimes my marker even skips a little bit just because I'm pressing so lightly. Next, I'll go in with my W3 and extend those areas out a little bit. Here, this is where I realized I forgot to draw in her little face with my Copic Save Pen. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that before I finish my coloring. Here I did flick out a little bit on her face just because it is a larger area, but I only did that on one side. So I don't know, I guess it's just habit. But for her little tail, I did create a shadow underneath her arm, again, just to differentiate between the two objects. Last, I'll go in with my W1, this is my lightest color, and just fill in the rest of those areas, just making sure that those colors blend nicely and that you can kind of tell the difference between one part of the stamped image and another. Next, we'll go on to coloring their little tutus. Now, I colored all of these the same exact way. I'm only going to show you one of them. I will color the elephant's tutu, and I'm going to be using my R80 markers here, and I'm doing the same exact technique as I've been doing, starting off with my lightest color, going to my darkest, then my mid-tone, then back to my lightest. Now for the darkest areas on her tutu, it would be underneath where her little arms are and where the top part of the tutu meets the skirt part. Also on either side, I'm adding a little bit of darker color there. Because this is a round object, my highlight will be in the center, more towards the front of her. I'll blend that out with my mid-tone and then go back to my lightest color. For the little bow in her hair, I'm just adding a little bit of shading on either side and blending that out each time, just to give it a little bit of dimension. It is such a tiny area that I really wasn't able to add any kind of lines or flicks there. Now for the bottom part of her tutu, it's kind of like ruffles. It's a very, very tiny area. You'd have a better luck coloring with more dimension with maybe color pencils in this particular area. So I'm basically just going over that line with my darkest color and then blending that out with my mid-tone and my lightest color. I'm not really worried about having too much dimension there just because it is such a tiny area. Now, I also forgot her little nails, I guess, on her feet. So I just used my W3, I believe it was, just to add a little bit of color there, just to make sure that the gray was a little bit different than the cool gray. Once all of my images were colored, I put those aside and I will fussy cut those out later. And we'll move on to our little stage scene. So I'm going to speed this up a lot because this took me a long time. For the wall in the background, I'm using my BG markers here, and I'm starting with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. This is my BG 72. My darkest areas are going to be on either side and underneath where the curtain kind of lays over some of that wall. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color. This is the BG 78, I believe. And I'm just going over those very darkest areas. I am doing some flicking here. This is a huge area to cover on either side, and then just drawing a very faint line underneath the curtain. Next, I'll go in with my BG75 and I'm flicking those out even further. I'm not going all the way. I want to make sure that I have a pretty large highlight right there in the center, flicking out on either side, and then just thickening up that line that we created underneath that curtain. Finally, I'll go back to my BG72, extend those flicks even further, and then just use the side of my nib there to fill in the entire area. Now, when you're filling in a huge area like this with your brush nib, keep turning your marker, because as you're coloring, that part of the nib is going to go dry. Your marker, it doesn't mean your marker is dry. So just flip the marker around as you go and you'll get better coverage. Now for the curtain itself, obviously I didn't draw in any folds to this curtain, so we're going to create them with our Copics. I'm starting off with the sides of the curtain that hang down, starting off with my lightest color, which was going to be an R02, but realized that that marker is almost completely dry and I do not have a refill. So I'm going to bring in my RV13, and I'm just creating a shadow underneath the top part of the curtain, and then just doing a few long flicks from the center where it's gathered up. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color and basically go over those same areas. These long flicks that we're creating are going to kind of look like folds within the curtain later. Next, I'll go in with my very darkest midtone. In this case, I'm using 5 different colors, extending those flicks out further, as well as the line underneath the curtain on top. For my next color, I'm starting to add a little bit of shading as well as extending those flicks. And for my lightest midtone here, adding a little bit more shading, but not extending those flicks. I want to make sure that those stay pretty dark in order to make them look like the folds within the curtain. Last, I'll go in with my lightest color and fill in that entire area. And we'll move on to the top part of the curtain, which basically we're going to do the same thing. So again, taking that lightest color, but I'm going to put my little folds right there in the center. So I'm just drawing little curvy lines on each part of this curtain, as well as creating a shadow on either side where the side droopy parts of it are underneath that middle section. Going in with my darkest color, very tip of my marker here. I don't want these lines to be too thick, because each time I'm thickening them up even more, and I don't want them to end up taking up the whole area. Going in with my darkest midtone, again, extending those lines. For my next color, I'm starting to flick out and create my shadow there, as well as extending those folds within that curtain even more. Not only am I extending them in length, I'm also thickening them up. Extending my shadow out with my next mid-tone color, as well as these little folds, making them pretty thick now. And finally, I'll go in with my lightest color and fill in that entire area. Now again, I'm turning my marker each time. This isn't as large of an area, but you can notice that sometimes you see a few little streaks there where it's not getting good coverage. You can go over it more than once, but turning your marker definitely does help. Next, we'll move on to the floor, and I'm going to do a really quick, simple wood grain here. And I'm starting off with my E50, and I'm covering up the entire area. This is mainly just to make sure that my area is saturated. That way my colors will blend nicely. Next, I'll go in with my E37, and I'm going to be creating my shadow underneath where this little curtain is, as well as either side of this little stage. Next, I'll go in with my E33, which is my darkest midtone, but this is also going to be the color that I'm going to create my little squiggly lines. And I don't have much of an area to work with here because the little planks or boards that we created are really tiny. So I'm barely touching my marker. It's kind of skipping around, and I'm just creating squiggly lines. Some of them are straight, some of them are little dots even, but I'm going across the entire floor. And I'm also going to make sure that either side is going to be a little bit darker too. Now here's where I realized that that yellow marker that I used in the beginning is going to end up being completely covered because I'm using darker colors than what that marker was. So I'm going in with that same E37, using my T-square ruler and going directly over the lines that we had created with that pen. Now here, you want to make sure that you are using the very, very tip of that marker, or else your lines are going to be pretty thick. You can see some of my lines were thicker than others, but once I add all my color down, you're not going to be able to tell. Most of this will be blended out a little bit. So I did take that same E37 and some of these squiggly lines on either side. I just darkened those up because these are going to be the darkest areas of my floor. Next, I'll go in with that E33 and extend these flicks out a little further and add that shadow to the very bottom of the stage. Next, I'll go in with my E31, extend those flicks out even further, just making sure that I leave that highlight there in the center of the stage. And that is when I will go in with my E50, and again, extending those flicks and covering up that entire area, blending all of those colors out together. Next, I will take my little images here and I fussy cut these off camera. This video is long enough. I didn't think you'd want to watch me fussy cut these out. Just getting my placement, I figured I'd put the giraffe in the center to give it a little pop of color, being I have gray on either side. I'm using my Scotch foam tape here to pop these up onto my panel. Now, once I had my images down, I realized I definitely need something else. So I'm bringing out my E30 markers again and creating a shadow underneath these little characters, starting with my E37, blending that out with my E33, then my E31, and then finally that E50, which was the lightest color that we used for the little floor. Now for the sentiments in this set are just adorable. The one that I chose is If the Tutu Fits Twirl. I'm just using my grid mat here to line this up onto an acrylic block, and I'll be stamping this with my VersaFine Onyx Black ink right below my little characters here. I did use a Nuvo sparkle pen to add a little bit of sparkle to their little tutus as well as the bows in their hair, and then adhered this to an A2 size card base. And that is it for this one, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.